Colorado Territory, 1873. The harsh light of a late summer afternoon cast long shadows across the rolling plains as Kade Daniels guided his horse along the winding trail towards Silverdale. At 25, he'd already spent more years than he cared to count in the saddle, driving cattle and doing odd jobs for ranchers across 3 territories. A fine layer of trail dust covered his chambray shirt, and his brown Stetson sat low over keen blue eyes that had seen too much violence for a man so young. Cade believed the West was no place for tender hearts. The frontier had taught him early that attachment meant pain and pain meant weakness, a weakness that could get a man killed. His father's ranch had been taken by men with guns and false papers when Cade was 16. His mother died shortly after from pneumonia, though Cade knew it was heartbreak that truly took her. Since then he'd kept moving, never staying in one place long enough for roots to take hold. Connection was a luxury he couldn't afford, what he wanted was simple enough. Earn enough money to buy a small plot of land somewhere quiet, where he could raise a few horses and live in peace. What he'd never admit, even to himself in the darkest hours of night, was the hollow ache that had settled in his chest years ago, an emptiness that whispered of loneliness whenever he made camp alone under the vast starlit sky. The sound caught his attention first, a soft sobbing carried on the breeze. Cade reined in his stallion Thunderbolt and listened. Trail-honed instincts told him to keep riding. A man alone with money in his pocket couldn't be too careful, and trouble often wore a pretty face. But something in the desperate quality of the crying made him hesitate. "Damn fool," he muttered to himself as he guided Thunderbolt off the trail toward a cluster of cottonwoods by a small stream. He spotted her beneath the largest tree, a young woman with her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with each sob. Her dress, once fine by the look of it, was torn at the hem and smudged with dirt. Long blonde hair tumbled around her shoulders in disarray, partially escaping what had been an elegant updo. A small valise lay beside her. Cade approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" The woman's head snapped up, revealing a face that stole the breath from Cade's lungs. Despite her tear-stained cheeks and reddened eyes, she was strikingly beautiful, delicate features framed by golden blonde hair and eyes the color of spring violets. She couldn't be more than 20 years old, and there was something refined about her that seemed utterly out of place in this wilderness. "Stay back," she warned, scrambling to her feet and backing against the tree trunk. Her accent wasn't Western, Eastern, maybe Boston or New York. Cade raised both hands, staying atop Thunderbolt. "I mean no harm, ma'am, just heard crying and thought someone might need help." The woman eyed him warily, taking in his trail-worn clothes and the revolver holstered at his hip. "How do I know you're not one of them?" "One of who, ma'am?" Her eyes darted around nervously, as though expecting men to materialize from the surrounding brush. "The men who have been following me." Cade frowned, scanning the horizon. The trail behind him was empty, and he'd seen no sign of pursuit. "I'm just a cowhand heading to Silverdale for work. Name's Kade Daniels." He touched the brim of his hat. "And I don't make a habit of bothering ladies in distress." Something in his straightforward manner seemed to reassure her slightly. She straightened her posture, attempting to gather her dignity despite her disheveled appearance. "I'm Nora," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Nora Nelson." The slight pause didn't escape Cade's notice, but he let it pass. "Miss Nelson, you're a fair piece from anywhere out here. What brings you to this stretch of nowhere?" Her chin lifted slightly. "I was traveling by stagecoach to Denver when we were set upon by bandits. The other passengers were robbed, but when they discovered who I was," she stopped abruptly. "That is, they seemed to take particular interest in me. I managed to slip away during the confusion and have been walking since morning." Cade's eyes narrowed. The woman was clearly hiding something, but her fear seemed genuine enough. The stagecoach robbery explained her appearance, but not why she would be singled out. "Silverdale's about 10 miles west," he said, measuring his words carefully. "I can escort you there if you'd like." "Safer than traveling alone." Hope flashed across her face before suspicion clouded it again. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." "Don't need to," Cade shrugged. "My ma raised me to help folks in trouble. Besides, I'm headed that way anyhow." She studied him for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, her shoulders slumped slightly. "I accept your offer, Mr. Daniels." "Thank you." Cade dismounted and approached her slowly, still keeping a respectful distance. Up close, he could see the fine quality of her dress beneath the dirt and tears, expensive fabric with delicate embroidery at the collar. This was no ordinary traveler. "Can you ride, Miss Nelson?" "Yes, though it's been some time." Cade nodded, then helped her gather her single valise. He secured it to Thunderbolt's saddle before offering her a hand up. She hesitated only briefly before accepting his assistance, settling side saddle with practiced grace despite her tattered dress. Cade swung up behind her, careful to maintain proper distance while still ensuring she wouldn't fall. Hold on to the pommel, he instructed, taking the reins. We'll go slow, but I'd like to make some progress before nightfall. As they set off at an easy pace, Cade couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just invited trouble into his carefully ordered life. Something about the woman's story didn't add up, and experience had taught him that secrets had a way of becoming dangerous on the frontier. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret stopping. There was something in those violet eyes that spoke of genuine fear, and perhaps something else that called to him in ways he wasn't ready to acknowledge. What Cade didn't know was that Nora Nelson was actually Nora Northcott, the missing heiress to one of the largest mining fortunes in Colorado territory. And the men pursuing her weren't simple bandits, but hired guns determined to ensure she never reached her inheritance, or her 21st birthday, now just 3 weeks away. The sun dipped lower as they rode, casting the landscape in amber light. Nora sat stiffly at first, but gradually relaxed as the miles passed without incident. She kept glancing behind them, clearly expecting pursuit. "You want to tell me what's really going on?" Cade finally asked as they stopped briefly to water the horse. Nora's hands fidgeted with the torn fabric of her dress. "I told you about the stagecoach robbery." "You did. But you didn't mention why those men would single you out, or why you're still afraid they're coming after you." He offered her his canteen. "Most bandits take what they want and move on. They don't give chase for days." She accepted the water, taking a small sip before handing it back. Their fingers brushed momentarily, and Cade was surprised by the jolt of awareness that shot through him. "Perhaps I'm simply being paranoid," she said, not meeting his eyes. Cade sighed. "Look, Miss Nelson, I'm not asking for your life story, but if there are men after you, I'd prefer to know what I'm riding into." For a moment, he thought she might confide in him. She opened her mouth, then closed it again as her eyes caught something in the distance. Cade followed her gaze to see a plume of dust on the horizon, riders moving fast. "They've found me," she whispered, face draining of color. Without hesitation, Cade helped her back onto Thunderbolt and mounted behind her. "Hold tight," he instructed, spurring the horse into a gallop. They rode hard, cutting away from the main trail and toward a line of rocky bluffs in the distance. Cade knew the terrain well enough to recognize a narrow canyon ahead that might provide cover. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger, 3 riders, maybe 4, gaining ground on their overburdened mount. Nora clung to the pommel, her body tense against his chest. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely audible above the pounding hooves. "I never meant to bring this trouble to you." "Save it," Cade replied, focusing on the path ahead. "We're not caught yet." They reached the canyon entrance as the sun touched the horizon, plunging into shadow as the walls rose around them. Cade guided Thunderbolt through the winding passage, ears straining for sounds of pursuit. When they emerged on the other side, he turned immediately into a densely wooded area, eventually finding a small clearing sheltered by pines. "We'll rest here," he decided, helping Nora down. The horse was lathered and breathing heavily. "With luck, they'll lose our trail in the canyon." Nora sank to the ground, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "How did you know this place was here?" "Drove cattle through this region 3 summers ago." Cade busied himself caring for Thunderbolt, removing the saddle to let the stallion cool down properly. "These woods aren't on any map I've seen. Locals avoid them, say they're haunted by Indian spirits." "And are they?" A hint of a smile touched her lips for the first time. "Haven't seen any ghosts yet." Cade returned the smile briefly before his expression grew serious again. "Those men back there, they're not just random bandits, are they?" In the fading light, Nora's face seemed to age, weariness settling into features too young for such burden. "No," she admitted quietly, "they're not." Cade waited, giving her space to continue. "My name is Nora Northcott," she finally said, watching his face carefully for recognition. The name meant nothing to him. "Should that mean something to me?" Relief flickered in her eyes. "My father was Edward Northcott. He owned the Silver Peak mine outside of Denver." That name Cade did know. Northcott's silver strike was legendary, one of the richest veins discovered in Colorado territory. "Was. He died 6 months ago." Nora's voice grew distant. "A mining accident, they said. I was back east at school when it happened. By the time I received word and made arrangements to return, my uncle had taken control of everything, the mine, the house, my father's holdings. Cade sat across from her, pieces beginning to fall into place. And these men work for your uncle? She nodded. Clayton Northcott never approved of my father's marriage to my mother. She was a singer at a Denver music hall, beautiful, but without family connections or fortune. When she died giving birth to me, my uncle told my father I should be sent away, raised by distant relations who could give me proper upbringing. But your father refused. He did. Instead, he sent me east for education, but always planned for me to return and take my place as his heir. Her hands twisted in her lap. My father's will stipulates that I inherit everything upon my 21st birthday, which is 3 weeks from now. If I fail to claim my inheritance by then, everything passes to my uncle permanently. Cade let out a long breath, and I reckon your uncle doesn't plan to let that happen. The stagecoach robbery was no coincidence. Those men knew exactly who I was, and they weren't interested in the other passengers' valuables. One of them said something about making sure she never reaches Denver. She looked up at Cade, fear and determination warring in her expression. I have to make it to Denver before my birthday. I have to claim what's rightfully mine. Night had fallen fully now, and Cade knew making a fire would be too risky. He retrieved a blanket from his saddlebag and offered it to Nora, who accepted it gratefully. Get some rest, he said. I'll keep watch. You believe me then? She asked, surprise evident in her voice. I believe you're in danger, Cade replied carefully. The rest about inheritances and mining fortunes, that's not my concern. But I won't leave you to face those men alone. Nora settled beneath the blanket, studying him in the moonlight that filtered through the pine branches. Why are you helping me, Mr. Daniels, truly? The question caught him off guard. Why was he risking his life for a stranger's troubles? The smart move would be to point her towards Silverdale and continue on his own way. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. There was something more, something about her courage and determination that spoke to him, that made him want to see her safely to her destination. But such thoughts were dangerous, creating connections where none should exist. Cade had learned long ago that attachments only led to pain. Once they reached Denver, he would see her safely to whatever authorities could help her claim her inheritance, and then he would move on, just as he always had. As Nora drifted into exhausted sleep, Cade sat with his back against a tree trunk, revolver across his knees, listening to the night sounds of the forest and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Morning came with a blanket of fog shrouding the trees, providing additional cover as they prepared to move on. Nora looked better after a night's rest, though her elegant dress was hardly suitable for rough travel. Cade offered her his spare shirt to wear over her bodice, which she accepted with gratitude. We'll avoid the main trails, Cade explained as they mounted Thunderbolt again. It'll take longer to reach Denver, but we're less likely to encounter your uncle's men. How long? Nora asked, settling in front of him. 5 days, maybe 6, Cade estimated. We'll need supplies. There's a trading post about half a day's ride from here where we can stock up. As they rode, Cade found himself increasingly aware of Nora's presence, the subtle floral scent of her hair, the way she sat straight back despite her exhaustion, the quiet determination in her voice when she spoke of honoring her father's wishes. It was distracting, and distraction was dangerous. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Daniels, Nora said, breaking a long silence. What brings you to Colorado territory? Work, he said simply. I go where the jobs are. Was heading to the Circle M ranch outside Silverdale when I found you. No family waiting for you somewhere. No, his tone made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate. Nora was quiet for a moment. I envy that sometimes, the freedom to go where you please, answering to no one. Cade couldn't help but laugh. Never thought I'd hear an heiress envy a saddle tramp. I may be an heiress on paper, but I've never felt like one, she replied. My father made sure I understood the value of work. Even when I was young, he would take me into the mines, show me how the men lived and worked. He wanted me to respect them, to understand that our fortune came from their labor. Sounds like an unusual man. He was, her voice softened with memory. Everyone said he was a fool for planning to leave everything to a daughter rather than seeking a male heir through remarriage. But he believed I could manage the business as well as any man if I was properly educated. And can you? Cade asked, genuinely curious. Nora turned slightly to meet his eyes, her expression resolute. Yes, Mr. Daniels, I can. I studied business and accounting alongside literature and music. I know how a mine operates, how ore is processed, how contracts are negotiated. I intend to run Silver Peak Mine with the same fairness and vision my father brought to it. Something in her confident declaration stirred Cade's admiration, though he tried to suppress it. This woman was not what he'd expected from an Eastern-educated heiress. There was substance beneath her beauty, steel beneath her refined manner. They reached the trading post by mid-afternoon, a crude wooden structure beside a slow-moving creek. A few horses were hitched outside and smoke rose from the chimney. Cade reined in Thunderbolt at a distance. "Wait here," he instructed Nora, dismounting. "I'll check that it's safe." "Be careful," she said, taking the reins from him. "My uncle's men could be anywhere." Cade approached the trading post cautiously, hand resting near his revolver. Through the dusty window, he could see an elderly shopkeeper and two customers who appeared to be trappers. No sign of the well-dressed gunmen who had pursued them. Inside, he quickly gathered supplies: coffee, jerky, flour, and ammunition, paying with coins from his dwindling funds. The shopkeeper, a grizzled man with a white beard, eyed him curiously. "Ain't seen you around these parts before," he commented as he wrapped the purchases. "Just passing through," Cade replied noncommittally. "Heading where, if you don't mind my asking?" "Denver way." The old man nodded. "Might want to be careful on the North Trail. Word is there's been trouble, men asking about travelers, offering rewards for information." He leaned forward slightly. "Particularly interested in a young blonde woman, traveling alone." Cade kept his expression neutral. "Appreciate the warning." "Good thing you're traveling solo then, ain't it?" The shopkeeper's eyes held a knowing glint. Cade laid an extra silver dollar on the counter. "Good thing." The old man pocketed the coin with a slight nod. "South Trail's longer but prettier this time of year, less traveled too." "I'll keep that in mind." Supplies secured, Cade returned to where Nora waited anxiously with Thunderbolt. "We need to move," he said quietly, stowing the provisions in his saddlebags. "Your uncle's men have been through here asking questions, offering rewards." Alarm flashed across her face. "Did anyone recognize me?" "Don't think so, but we shouldn't linger." He helped her mount and swung up behind her. "We'll take the South Trail, less traveled, according to the shopkeeper." They rode steadily through the afternoon, the terrain gradually becoming more rugged as they followed the winding trail southward. By evening, they had climbed into pine-covered foothills that offered good cover for making camp. Cade found a sheltered spot beside a small stream and determined it was safe enough to risk a small fire. As darkness fell, he prepared a simple meal of coffee and pan bread while Nora washed her face in the stream, combing her fingers through her tangled blonde hair. When she returned to the fire, Cade found himself watching the way the flickering light illuminated her features, the determined set of her jaw, the thoughtful intelligence in her eyes. She caught him looking and offered a tentative smile that made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. "You should eat," he said gruffly, passing her a tin plate. They ate in silence for a while before Nora spoke. "You never answered my question from earlier about why you have no family waiting for you." Cade stared into the fire, considering whether to deflect the question again. Something about the quiet night and her direct gaze made evasion seem pointless. "Lost them," he said finally. "Pa had a small ranch in Texas, nothing fancy, but it was ours, or so we thought. Men came one day with papers claiming they'd bought the land. When Pa disputed it, they shot him." The memory burned as fresh as if it had happened yesterday instead of 9 years ago. "Ma took sick after that, didn't last the winter." Nora's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, Cade." It was the first time she'd used his given name and the intimacy of it startled him. "It was a long time ago," he shrugged, uncomfortable with her compassion. "What did you do after?" "Drifted." "Worked ranches, drove cattle, did what I had to." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Learned that in this world a man's only real possession is himself, everything else can be taken." "Is that why you never stay in one place? Why you don't form attachments?" Her perception was unnervingly accurate. "Attachments are liabilities out here," he confirmed. "A man alone has only himself to worry about." "That sounds terribly lonely," Nora observed quietly. "Better lonely than dead," Cade replied, more harshly than he intended. "Or worse, watching someone you care about suffer while you can do nothing to help them." Nora was silent for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "My father used to say that a life without connection isn't really living, it's just existing." The word struck too close to the emptiness Cade carried within him. Your father wasn't riding the frontier, he countered. Out here, sentiment gets you killed. Is that what you believe kindness is, mere sentiment? She leaned forward slightly. You stopped to help me, Mr. Daniels, was that just sentiment? Cade had no ready answer. Why had he stopped? The question had plagued him since he first heard her crying by that stream. It had been foolish, reckless, even everything he'd trained himself not to be, yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Get some rest, he said instead of answering. We have a long ride tomorrow. Nora looked as though she might press the issue, but then nodded, settling onto the bedroll he'd arranged for her. Good night, Cade. Long after she had fallen asleep, Cade remained awake, troubled by questions he'd thought long settled in his mind. The frontier had taught him that survival meant isolation, that connection was a weakness he couldn't afford. Yet something about Nora Northcott challenged that belief, her courage in the face of danger, her determination to honor her father's legacy, her willingness to trust a stranger when she had every reason for suspicion. For the first time in years, Cade wondered if there might be another way to live, even in this harsh land. The thought was as terrifying as it was alluring. The next morning dawned clear, and they made good progress along the South Trail. Nora proved to be a resilient traveler, never complaining despite the discomfort of long hours in the saddle. They settled into a companionable rhythm, with Cade gradually revealing more about his years on the frontier and Nora sharing stories of her time at school in the East. By midday, the trail had led them to a high ridge overlooking a vast valley. In the distance, the Rocky Mountains rose majestically against the horizon. It's beautiful, Nora breathed, gazing out at the panorama. That it is, Cade agreed, though he found his eyes drawn to her profile rather than the scenery. The sunlight caught in her golden hair, and for a moment, he allowed himself to simply appreciate her beauty without the wariness that usually guarded his thoughts. As if sensing his regard, she turned to him with a smile that reached her eyes. Thank you, she said simply, for all of this. I know you had other plans before I came along. Plans change, he replied with a slight shrug. Circle M Ranch will still need hands when we reach Denver. The mention of Denver sobered her expression. Do you think we'll make it in time, before my birthday? If we keep this pace, yes. Cade didn't mention the other concern weighing on his mind, that her uncle's men might be waiting for them in the city, or that proving her identity without documentation might prove challenging. They continued on, descending into the valley as afternoon shadows lengthened. The trail wound through stands of aspen trees, their leaves beginning to hint at the golden transformation of early autumn. It was peaceful country, the kind that made Cade think of that small plot of land he hoped to call his own someday. The shot came without warning, a rifle crack that echoed through the trees. Thunderbolt reared in alarm as the bullet struck a tree trunk just ahead of them. Cade instinctively pulled Nora close, shielding her with his body as he fought to control the frightened horse. Into the trees, he commanded, spurring Thunderbolt off the trail and into the dense aspen grove to their right. Another shot rang out, this one coming closer as they weaved between the slender white trunks. How did they find us? Nora gasped, clinging to the saddle horn. Questions later, Cade replied grimly, focusing on putting distance between them and their pursuers. He could hear horses behind them now, at least two, maybe three riders. They emerged from the trees at the bank of a swift-flowing river. Cade hesitated only briefly before guiding Thunderbolt into the water. The current was strong but not dangerously so, and the horse was a powerful swimmer. They crossed diagonally, letting the current carry them downstream to further confuse their trail. On the opposite bank, Cade didn't slow, pushing deeper into unfamiliar territory. Only when Thunderbolt began to show signs of exhaustion did he finally rein in, listening intently for sounds of pursuit. The forest was quiet except for birdsong and the distant rush of the river. I think we lost them, he said, helping Nora dismount in a small clearing. She was pale but composed, showing a fortitude that impressed him. They were waiting for us, she said, brushing wet hair from her face. How could they have known which trail we'd take? Cade frowned, considering. The shopkeeper mentioned the North Trail specifically, steered us south. Could have been a setup. You think he was working with my uncle? Or just took a better offer from men asking questions. Cade removed Thunderbolt's saddle to let the horse rest properly. Money loosens tongues out here. Nora sank onto a fallen log, the reality of their situation settling heavily on her shoulders. They won't stop, will they? Not until I'm dead or my birthday passes. Probably not, Cade saw no point in offering false comfort. But we still have the advantage. They don't know exactly where we are, and we have a head start toward Denver. If we can make it there at all. She looked around at the unfamiliar wilderness. Do you even know where we are now? Cade studied the position of the sun, considering their route since leaving the trading post. We're still headed in the right general direction, but we've been pushed farther south than I planned. There's a settlement called Pine Creek that should be a day's ride from here. We can resupply there and get better directions to Denver. Night was approaching, and their clothes were damp from the river crossing. Cade knew they needed fire and shelter, but he was reluctant to make camp so soon after the ambush. We should keep moving until full dark, he decided. Find somewhere more defensible to spend the night. Nora nodded, rising with determination despite her obvious fatigue. Whatever you think is best. They traveled for another hour as dusk deepened around them, eventually finding a small cave set into a rocky hillside. It wasn't deep, but it offered better protection than the open forest, with a clear view of the approach from the front and solid rock at their backs. Cade built a small fire near the cave entrance, positioning it so the light wouldn't be visible from a distance. Their provisions had stayed mostly dry in the oilskin-wrapped saddlebags, and he prepared a simple meal while Nora spread their damp clothes to dry near the fire. You're good at this, she observed, watching him work. Living off the land, I mean. Necessary skill out here. Cade handed her a cup of hot coffee. Your father ever teach you wilderness ways along with those business lessons? A fond smile touched her lips. Some, he believed in practical education. We would camp sometimes near the mine property. He taught me to fish, to identify edible plants. Her smile faded. Uncle Clayton thought it was ridiculous, said he was raising me like a savage instead of a proper lady. Seems to me those skills are serving you better now than knowing which fork to use at dinner. Nora laughed softly. True enough, she sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. What about you? What kind of land are you saving for? You mentioned wanting your own place someday. Cade was surprised. She'd remembered that casual comment from days earlier. Nothing fancy, few acres with good water, enough pasture for some horses, maybe a stand of timber for building. That sounds lovely, she said sincerely. Would you build the house yourself? That's the plan. Simple cabin at first, something more substantial later on. He rarely articulated these dreams aloud, yet found himself continuing. Good barn is more important than a fancy house anyway. Get the essentials right first. And after the essentials, what then? The question caught him off guard. He'd never really thought beyond the basic establishment of his ranch. The future had always been a vague concept, a place of solitude where he answered to no one. Hadn't thought that far, he admitted. Nora's expression grew thoughtful. Wouldn't you be lonely, all alone on your land? The question struck at the contradiction he'd never fully resolved, his desire for a home of his own against his conviction that attachments were dangerous. A man gets used to his own company, he said finally, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Perhaps, Nora's voice was gentle, but is that really living or just existing, as my father would say? Cade had no answer that didn't feel like a lie, so he busied himself with banking the fire for the night. You should sleep. I'll take first watch. Though Nora looked as if she wanted to pursue the conversation, she nodded and settled onto the bedroll he'd arranged for her near the back of the cave. Within minutes, exhaustion had claimed her, leaving Cade alone with thoughts more troubling than any physical danger they faced. The night passed without incident, and they set out at first light toward Pine Creek. The day's journey took them through increasingly rugged terrain, steep ridges and narrow valleys that slowed their progress but provided good cover from potential pursuers. By late afternoon, they crested a hill and saw smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. The small settlement of Pine Creek nestled in a valley below. Cade studied it carefully through his field glass before deciding to approach. Looks peaceful enough, he said, passing the glass to Nora, but we should be cautious. Your uncle's men could have sent word ahead. What do you suggest? Nora asked, scanning the collection of wooden buildings. You'll wait in those trees. He pointed to a dense grove about a quarter-mile from the settlement. I'll go in alone, get what we need, ask some questions. If anything seems wrong, I'll come straight back. Nora frowned, clearly disliking the plan. And if something happens to you, what am I supposed to do then? Her concern surprised him and warmed something in his chest he thought long cold. I can handle myself, he assured her. But if I'm not back by nightfall, take Thunderbolt and head northeast. Follow the North Star, stick to cover, and you'll reach the Denver road eventually. I'm not leaving you behind, she said firmly. Yes, you are if it comes to that. Cade's tone brooked no argument. Your father's legacy is what matters here. Getting you to Denver before your birthday is the priority. Nora looked as though she might protest further, but then nodded reluctantly. Be careful. They made their way to the grove, where Cade helped Nora dismount and ensured she had water and provisions. He checked his revolver, making sure it was fully loaded before tucking it back into its holster. 2 hours at most, he promised. Stay hidden. As he turned to leave, Nora caught his arm. Before he could react, she rose on her toes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. For luck, she whispered, stepping back with a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Stunned, Cade could only nod before mounting Thunderbolt and riding toward Pine Creek, the feeling of her lips lingering on his skin like a brand. Pine Creek proved to be a dusty collection of buildings centered around a main street, a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a handful of rough cabins. A few horses were hitched outside the saloon, and an old dog slept in the afternoon sun on the store's porch. It had the appearance of a settlement barely clinging to existence, the kind of place that might disappear entirely within a few years. Cade hitched Thunderbolt outside the general store and entered, senses alert for any sign of trouble. The interior was dim and cluttered, shelves stocked with a haphazard collection of essentials. A middle-aged woman with graying hair looked up from behind the counter. Afternoon, she greeted him. Don't get many strangers through here these days. Just passing through, Cade replied, selecting items they needed: ammunition, dried beans, salt, coffee. Heading where, if I might ask? Denver Way, he answered cautiously. The woman nodded, showing no particular interest. Road's about 15 miles northeast of here. Not much traffic this time of year, though. Any trouble on the road lately? Cade asked casually. Nothing unusual. Why do you ask? Heard rumors about bandits. The woman shrugged. Always rumors. Haven't seen any trouble personally. She began tallying his purchases. You planning to stay the night? We've got rooms above the saloon. Nothing fancy, but clean enough. Just supplies today. Cade paid for the goods, then hesitated. One more thing. Have any strangers come through recently? Maybe asking questions about travelers. The woman's expression sharpened with interest. Matter of fact, yes, 2 men rode through yesterday, city types with fancy guns, asked if we'd seen a young blonde woman traveling alone or with a single companion. Her eyes narrowed. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Cade kept his expression neutral. Can't say that I do. What did you tell them? Truth, haven't seen any such woman in months. She leaned forward slightly. But they left something with the barkeeper next door, a reward notice for information, said they'd be checking back. Appreciate the warning, Cade said, gathering his purchases. Word of advice, the woman added as he turned to leave. Whatever you're mixed up in, and I'm not asking what that might be, folks around here mind their own business. But money has a way of changing that. I'd move on quick if I were you. Cade nodded his thanks and exited the store, scanning the street carefully before untying Thunderbolt. The settlement seemed quiet, but the knowledge that Nora's uncle's men had been there so recently put him on edge. They needed to be gone before those men returned to check for information. He was about to mount when the saloon doors swung open and 3 men emerged, talking loudly. 2 were clearly locals, but the third, a well-dressed man with a city-cut coat and polished boots, matched the description of the men who had been pursuing them. Cade turned away quickly, adjusting Thunderbolt's saddle to avoid being seen directly. Sure, she'll come this way eventually, the well-dressed man was saying. All roads lead to Denver in these parts, and that's where she's headed. What the girl do anyway? One of the locals asked. Family matter, the man replied dismissively. Her uncle's worried sick about her, gone a bit touched in the head, you understand, dangerous to herself. Cade's jaw tightened at the lie. He kept his head down as the men approached. That's a fine horse, the well-dressed man commented, stopping to admire Thunderbolt. Don't see many of that quality out here. Thank you, Cade replied tersely, still not making direct eye contact. You passing through or staying in town? The man asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Just stopping for supplies, heading south. South? The man sounded surprised. Not much down that way except mining camps. Got work waiting at the Blue Eagle mine, Cade lied smoothly. The man nodded, seeming to lose interest. Well, good luck to you. If you happen to see a young blonde woman on your travels, about 20 years old, refined looking, there's good money for information. She's my employer's niece, gone missing from home. Family's worried sick. I'll keep an eye out, Cade promised, finally mounting Thunderbolt. Good day, gentlemen. He rode south out of town at an unhurried pace, fighting the urge to look back or ride faster. Only when Pine Creek was out of sight did he circle around, taking a roundabout route back to where Nora waited anxiously in the grove of trees. Thank goodness, she breathed when he appeared. I was beginning to worry. We need to move, Cade said tersely, helping her onto Thunderbolt. Your uncle's men were in Pine Creek yesterday, and one of them is still there. Alarm flashed across Nora's face. Did he see you? Yes, but I don't think he recognized me. Told him I was headed south to work at a mine. Cade mounted behind her, turning Thunderbolt northeast, away from the settlement, but it won't take long for him to get suspicious if we're spotted heading toward Denver. They rode hard until dusk, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Pine Creek. When they finally made camp in a sheltered ravine, Cade felt reasonably confident they hadn't been followed, but the close call had shaken him. The net was tightening around them and Denver was still days away. As they sat beside their small fire that night, Nora seemed unusually quiet, lost in thought as she stared into the flames. Something on your mind? Cade finally asked. She looked up, her violet eyes reflecting firelight. I was thinking about what that man told the locals, that I'm touched in the head. It's clever, really. If I'm declared incompetent, I couldn't legally inherit even if I reached Denver in time. Is that possible? With enough money and influence? Absolutely, Nora's expression hardened. My uncle has spent years building connections while my father focused on the mine. Judges, bankers, newspaper editors, he knows them all. Cade considered this new complication. You'll need allies in Denver. Is there anyone there you can trust? Anyone who is loyal to your father? Nora thought for a moment. The mine foreman Thomas Harker, he worked with my father for 15 years, and possibly Mr. Greaves at the Denver Mercantile Bank. He and my father were friends. She frowned suddenly. But I have no way to prove who I am. All my identification papers were in my trunk on the stagecoach. Your father must have had documents, birth certificates, legal papers. Yes, in his study at the house. But that's now under my uncle's control. Cade nodded grimly. So we need to get you to Denver, find allies, and somehow obtain proof of your identity, all before your birthday, while avoiding men trying to kill you. To his surprise, Nora actually smiled. When you put it that way, it sounds rather exciting, doesn't it? Despite the gravity of their situation, Cade found himself chuckling. You're not what I expected, Miss Northcott. No? And what did you expect? A frightened society girl who'd collapse at the first sign of hardship. He met her eyes across the fire. Instead, you're sitting here planning how to outmaneuver men who want you dead after days of hard riding and sleeping on the ground. Nora's smile softened. My father didn't raise me to be fragile, Mr. Daniels. He believed strength comes in many forms. She hesitated, then added quietly, just as I believe there are many kinds of courage, including the kind that stops to help a crying woman despite every instinct for self-preservation. Her words struck deep, penetrating the carefully constructed barriers around Cade's heart. He looked away, uncomfortable with the warmth spreading through his chest. We should get some rest, he said gruffly. Long ride tomorrow. But as he took the first watch, staring out into the darkness beyond their camp, Cade knew something fundamental had shifted within him. The woman sleeping peacefully behind him had awakened feelings he'd thought long buried, not just desire, though that was certainly part of it, but something deeper. Admiration, respect, and a growing belief that perhaps connection wasn't always a weakness. Perhaps sometimes it could be a source of strength. The thought was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The next 3 days passed in a pattern of cautious travel and watchful nights. They avoided settlements and main trails, even as this slowed their progress toward Denver. Cade estimated they were still at least 2 days from the city, with only 5 days remaining until Nora's 21st birthday. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they topped a rise and saw a disturbing sight in the valley below, a group of 6 riders moving methodically through the terrain, clearly searching for something. Or someone. Your uncle isn't sparing any expense, Cade observed grimly, studying the men through his field glass. Those are professional trackers, not just hired guns. Nora's face paled. How can we possibly avoid them all? Cade considered their options, none of them good. The trackers were between them and the most direct route to Denver, and trying to circle around would cost precious time they didn't have. We need a diversion, he decided finally, something to draw them away while we slip past. As they discussed possibilities, the skies that had been threatening all day finally opened, rain beginning to fall in heavy sheets. What had seemed a hindrance suddenly became an opportunity. The rain will mask our trail, Cade realized. If we move now while visibility is poor, we might slip right past them. They rode through the downpour, soaked to the skin but grateful for the cover it provided. The terrain became treacherous, mud sucking at Thunderbolt's hooves as they navigated steep slopes and swollen creeks. By nightfall, they had successfully bypassed the search party, but found themselves in unfamiliar territory with no dry place to camp. Just as desperation was setting in, they spotted a flicker of light in the distance, a cabin nestled against a hillside, smoke rising from its chimney despite the rain. Could be a trap, Cade warned, studying the isolated dwelling. Or it could be shelter, Nora countered, shivering visibly in her sodden clothes. We won't survive another night in this weather without fire. Cade knew she was right. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and hypothermia was a real danger. After observing the cabin for nearly an hour and seeing no sign of unusual activity, he decided to approach. The cabin's occupant proved to be an elderly trapper named Fergus, who welcomed them with gruff hospitality when Cade explained they'd been caught in the storm. If he was curious about the odd pair, a cowboy and a clearly well-bred young woman, he didn't show it, merely offering them space by his fire and a portion of the rabbit stew bubbling in a pot on his small stove. Not often I get visitors this far out, he commented as they warmed themselves, especially not in weather like this. We're grateful for your kindness, Nora said sincerely, her wet hair hanging in tendrils around her face. Where you folks headed? Fergus asked, filling bowls with stew. Cade hesitated, but Nora answered before he could. Denver, my aunt is ill and we're trying to reach her before. She let the implication hang in the air. The old man nodded sympathetically. Hard journey in this weather. Denver's still a good 40 miles northeast of here. 40 miles, Cade exchanged a concerned glance with Nora. They'd been knocked further off course than he'd realized. At their current pace, even with good weather, they might not reach the city in time. Fergus seemed to sense their dismay. There's a faster way if you're willing to risk it. Old mining road cuts through the mountains. Rough going in spots, but it'll save you near a day's travel. Is it passable in this weather? Cade asked. For a good horse and riders who know what they're about should be, the old man studied them thoughtfully. Course, there's other risks. That road ain't much used these days, except by folks who don't want to be seen. Outlaws, Cade frowned, sometimes, but they generally leave decent folk alone, long as you don't look like you're carrying valuables. Fergus turned to a crude map pinned to his wall, tracing a route with his gnarled finger. You follow the creek north from here till you hit a split boulder, can't miss it, looks like it was cleaved by the devil himself. Trail runs east from there, up through Sawyer's Pass, then down into the foothills outside Denver. Cade committed the directions to memory, hope kindling at the prospect of a shorter route. We're in your debt, Mr. Fergus. The old man waved away his thanks. Been alone out here too long, nice to have company even for a night, he eyed Nora's bedraggled appearance. Got some old clothes belonged to my daughter before she moved east, might fit you better than those wet things. The offered garments, a simple calico dress and woolen shawl, were plain but clean and most importantly dry. Nora accepted them gratefully, changing behind a blanket Fergus hung for privacy while Cade's own clothes steamed by the fire. That night they slept on pallets before the hearth, the storm raging outside but unable to touch them in the snug cabin. Cade found himself watching Nora as she slept, her face peaceful in the firelight, golden hair spread across the borrowed pillow. Something fierce and protective swelled in his chest, a feeling he could no longer deny or dismiss. He was falling in love with Nora Northcott. The realization should have terrified him, should have sent him running as it contradicted everything he'd believed about survival on the frontier. Instead, it settled into his heart with the rightness of a key fitting a lock, as though a part of him had always been waiting for her, even when he didn't know it. Morning brought clearing skies and the daunting knowledge that they now faced a race against time. After a breakfast of coffee and cornbread, they thanked Fergus for his hospitality and set out for the mining road he had described. That girl's in some kind of trouble, ain't she? The old man asked Cade quietly as they prepared to leave. What makes you say that? Fergus snorted. Been around long enough to know when someone's running from something. Don't worry, not my business to pry. He glanced at Nora, who was checking Thunderbolt's saddle. But whatever it is, she's lucky to have you watching out for her. Other way around, I think, Cade replied, surprising himself with the admission. The old trapper smiled knowingly. Figured as much, way you look at her says plenty. he offered his hand. Good luck to you both. They found the split boulder exactly where Fergus had described, and turned east onto a narrow track that wound upward into the mountains. The trail was indeed rough, in places little more than a ledge cut into the mountainside, with a sheer drop on one side and towering rock face on the other. Thunderbolt picked his way carefully, sure-footed despite the challenging terrain. By midday they had climbed high enough to see for miles across the rugged landscape. In the far distance, the plains stretched toward Denver, hazy on the horizon. "We're going to make it," Nora said, her voice filled with determined hope. "We are," Kate agreed, finding her confidence contagious. The path ahead was still fraught with danger, but for the first time he truly believed they might succeed. They continued climbing through the afternoon, the trail growing steeper as they approached Sawyer's Pass. According to Fergus, once they crossed the pass, the route would descend quickly toward Denver, with easier going on the eastern slopes. They were perhaps a mile from the pass when disaster struck. A section of trail, weakened by the previous night's rain, suddenly gave way beneath Thunderbolt's hooves. The horse whinnied in terror as the ground crumbled, sending all three of them sliding toward the edge of a steep ravine. Kade reacted instinctively, throwing himself and Nora clear of the horse as Thunderbolt scrambled for purchase. The stallion managed to find solid ground, but Kade and Nora tumbled down the slope, a cascade of rocks and mud accompanying their fall. When they finally came to rest nearly 60 feet below the trail, Cade's first thought was for Nora. He found her a few yards away, partially buried in loose soil and debris. "Nora," he scrambled to her side, heart pounding with fear. "Are you hurt?" She groaned, pushing herself upright with shaking arms. "I don't think anything's broken," she winced as she tried to stand. "My ankle, I think I twisted it." Kade helped her to a sitting position and examined her ankle, which was already beginning to swell. "Bad sprain," he diagnosed grimly. "You won't be walking far on that." Looking up at the slope they'd fallen down, the magnitude of their predicament became clear. The ravine walls were too steep and unstable to climb directly, especially with Nora injured. Above, Thunderbolt watched anxiously from the remains of the trail, whinnying in distress but unable to reach them. "What now?" Nora asked, her voice steady despite the pain evident on her face. Kade surveyed their surroundings, noting that the ravine appeared to continue downslope, eventually widening into what might be a more navigable path. "We follow the ravine down," he decided. "Find a place where we can climb out, or where it opens enough for Thunderbolt to reach us. And if we can't?" He met her eyes directly. "Then we keep going on foot. Denver can't be more than 20 miles from here." "Even with your injury, we can make it in 2 days if necessary." Nora nodded, her determination unshaken. "Then we'd better get started." Kade fashioned a crude walking stick for her from a broken branch, then whistled for Thunderbolt to follow along the trail above them. The intelligent horse seemed to understand, keeping pace as they began their slow progress down the ravine. The going was difficult, with loose rock and mud making each step treacherous. Kade supported Nora as much as possible, but her face grew increasingly pale with pain and exertion. By the time the sun began to set, they had covered less than 2 miles, and the ravine showed no sign of becoming more passable. "We need to stop for the night," Kade announced, helping Nora to a relatively flat area sheltered by an overhanging rock. Above them, Thunderbolt had found a patch of grass near the trail and was grazing contentedly. "We don't have time," Nora protested, though exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. "You need rest," Kade insisted gently. "We'll make better time tomorrow if you're not collapsing from pain." He set about making a meager camp with the limited supplies he had managed to grab during their fall: his canteen, a small bag of jerky, and his revolver. No blankets, no coffee, no means of making fire. The night promised to be cold and uncomfortable. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Kade settled beside Nora in the small shelter, putting his arm around her to share warmth. She leaned into him gratefully, her head resting against his shoulder. "2 more days until my birthday," she murmured, her voice tinged with worry. "We'll make it," Kade promised, though doubt gnawed at him. With her injury slowing them down and their current position off the main trail, reaching Denver in time seemed increasingly unlikely. "And if we don't?" Nora asked softly. "What then?" Kade had been avoiding this question, but now it had to be faced. "We find another way to prove your claim. Your uncle may have the law on his side if we miss the deadline, but that doesn't mean the fight is over." She was quiet for a long moment. "Would you stay to help me fight, I mean?" The question stirred something deep within him, a longing he'd denied for years. "Yes," he said simply, "I'd stay." Nora turned slightly to look at him, her face close to his in the darkness. Why? You barely know me, this isn't your battle. Kade met her gaze steadily, knowing the time for half-truths had passed. Because somewhere between that stream where I found you crying and this ravine, you became more important to me than any plan or dream I ever had. The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and raw. Nora's eyes widened slightly, then softened with an emotion that mirrored his own. I've been alone most of my life, she whispered. Even with my father there was always a distance, his focus on the mine, my schooling in the East. I never belonged anywhere, not really. Her hand found his in the darkness. Until now, until you. Kade didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. When he finally looked up, she was watching him with such tenderness that something broke open inside him, all the carefully constructed walls crumbling in an instant. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, she met him halfway, her lips touching his with a sweetness that made his heart ache. The kiss deepened, gentle yet urgent, a confirmation of feelings that had been growing since that first moment by the stream. When they finally parted, Kade rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by the intensity of what he felt. I've spent 9 years believing that caring for someone was a weakness I couldn't afford, he confessed. That connection's only brought pain. And now, Nora's voice was barely a whisper, now I think I was wrong about everything. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. I think maybe the only thing that matters in this life is finding someone worth the risk. They held each other through the cold night, finding comfort in closeness that went beyond the physical. By morning, something fundamental had changed between them, a commitment deeper than words, a partnership forged in shared hardship and growing love. Dawn brought both clarity and urgency. Examining the ravine in better light, Kade spotted what appeared to be a gentler slope about half a mile ahead. If we can reach that point, we might be able to get back to the trail, he told Nora as he helped her to her feet. Her ankle was worse this morning, swollen and mottled with bruising, but she gritted her teeth and leaned on her makeshift walking stick. Then let's go. Their progress was painfully slow, each step an exercise in determination for Nora. Above them, Thunderbolt continued to follow faithfully along the trail, occasionally nickering encouragement. When they reached the spot Kade had identified, the slope did indeed appear more manageable, rocky but not as steep as the walls that had surrounded them thus far. Still, it would be a challenging climb, especially for Nora with her injured ankle. I'll go first, Kade decided, test the ground, make sure it's stable, then I'll help you up. The climb was grueling. What had looked relatively easy from below proved treacherous, with loose rocks that shifted underfoot and patches of mud still slick from the recent rain. Several times, Kade nearly lost his footing, catching himself just in time. When he finally reached the trail, muscles burning with exertion, Thunderbolt greeted him with an affectionate nudge. Good boy, Kade praised, quickly checking that their remaining supplies were still secure in the saddlebags. Then he turned his attention to helping Nora. The process was slow and dangerous. Kade lay flat on the ground, extending his arms down the slope while Nora struggled upward, using her good foot and free hand to propel herself toward him. Twice she slipped, sending small avalanches of pebbles cascading down the ravine. By the time Kade finally caught her hands and pulled her the last few feet to safety, they were both trembling with exhaustion. We made it, Nora gasped, collapsing beside him on the trail. Kade gathered her into his arms, relief making him almost lightheaded. For a few precious moments they simply held each other, the warmth of their embrace a stark contrast to the cold ground beneath them. Reality intruded all too soon. We need to keep moving, Kade said reluctantly. We've lost too much time already. With great care, he helped Nora onto Thunderbolt's back, then mounted behind her, cradling her against his chest as they continued along the precarious trail. The path grew wider as they approached Sawyer's Pass, until finally they crested the ridge and saw the eastern slopes stretching before them, and in the far distance the buildings of Denver. One more day, Kade estimated, following Nora's gaze. If we push hard, we can reach the city by tomorrow night. Their descent from the mountains was faster than the ascent had been, the trail better maintained on this side of the pass. By nightfall they had reached the foothills, where they found a small creek and made camp for what they hoped would be their last night on the trail. With a fire for warmth and clean water to wash away the dust of their ordeal, their spirits rose. Nora's ankle, though still painful, had responded well to the cold creek water Kade had used to reduce the swelling. What will you do? Nora asked as they sat beside the fire, sharing the last of their provisions. After we reach Denver and sort out this business with my inheritance. Cade considered the question, looking into the dancing flames. A week ago, his answer would have been simple: move on, find work, continue his solitary existence. Now everything had changed. That depends, he said finally, meeting her eyes across the fire. On what? On whether a mining heiress might have use for a cowboy with no prospects beyond a dream of a small ranch someday. Nora's expression softened, her eyes reflecting the firelight. I think she might have considerable use for such a man, especially one brave enough to help a crying woman by a stream, even when his instincts told him to ride on. Cade moved to sit beside her, taking her hand in his. I'm not offering because of your inheritance, he said earnestly. I need you to know that. If tomorrow we reach Denver and find your uncle has somehow won, if you end up with nothing but the clothes on your back, my feelings wouldn't change. I know, Nora said simply, touching his face. Just as I'm not drawn to you for protection or safe passage, I'm drawn to the man who stops to help strangers despite his own rules against attachment, the man who treats a woman as an equal, not a delicate flower to be sheltered. The man who made me believe I could face anything, as long as he was by my side. Their kiss was tender, a promise of possibilities neither had dared imagine before their paths crossed. When they finally settled for sleep, it was in each other's arms, the uncertainties of tomorrow temporarily forgotten in the certainty of what they had found together. They reached the outskirts of Denver as the sun was setting the following day, the eve of Nora's 21st birthday. The city spread before them, a sprawling collection of buildings both grand and humble, streets buzzing with activity even as evening approached. Where do we go first? Cade asked as they rode slowly down the main thoroughfare, conscious of the stares their travel-worn appearance attracted. Nora considered for a moment. The mine office. If Thomas Harker is still foreman, he'll help us. He was my father's most trusted employee. The Silver Peak Mining Company offices occupied a handsome brick building near the center of town. As they approached, Cade noted the quality of the construction and furnishings visible through the windows, evidence of the operation's profitability. Wait here, he told Nora, helping her dismount carefully. Let me make sure it's safe before you go in. The office was nearly empty at this late hour, with just a clerk preparing to lock up for the night. The young man looked up in surprise as Cade entered, taking in his trail-worn appearance with obvious suspicion. We're closed, sir. You'll have to come back tomorrow. I need to speak with Thomas Harker, Cade said firmly. It's urgent. The clerk's expression grew even warier. Mr. Harker no longer works here. He was let go 3 months ago. This news was an unwelcome complication. Where can I find him? I'm not at liberty to say. The clerk began gathering papers, clearly eager to be rid of his dusty visitor. If you have business with the mine, you'll need to speak with Mr. Clayton Northcott tomorrow. The mention of Nora's uncle confirmed their fears. He had indeed taken control of the operation. Cade pressed further, adopting a more authoritative tone. This concerns Mr. Edward Northcott's daughter. Her life may be in danger. The clerk hesitated, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. Miss Northcott, but she's back east at school. She's here in Denver, Cade replied. And she needs to speak with her father's foreman immediately. Perhaps it was the urgency in Cade's voice or some lingering loyalty to the former mine owner, but the clerk's resistance crumbled. Harker took a position at the Golden Aspen mine after Mr. Northcott died. He has rooms above Donovan's livery on Pine Street. Thank you, Cade turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, does Clayton Northcott usually work late at the office? No, sir, he rarely comes in at all these days, spends most of his time at the Northcott mansion or his club. This was welcome news. They could proceed to find Harker without immediate risk of encountering Nora's uncle. Cade rejoined Nora outside, quickly sharing what he had learned. Thomas took another position, she mused as they made their way toward Pine Street. That's not surprising. He and my uncle never got along. Clayton thought him too loyal to my father and not deferential enough to the Northcott name. Donovan's livery proved to be a well-maintained establishment at the eastern end of Pine Street. The stables were quiet at this hour, with just a single stableman forking fresh hay into the stalls. We're looking for Thomas Harker, Cade told the man. I understand he has rooms here. The stableman pointed to an external staircase leading to a small apartment above the office. Up there. He should be home by now. Shifts at the Golden Aspen end at sunset. Kade helped Nora navigate the stairs, her ankles still tender despite the day's rest on horseback. At the top, they found a simple door with a brass knocker. Nora took a deep breath, then raised her hand and knocked firmly. The door was opened by a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a weathered face and clear, intelligent eyes. Those eyes widened in shock as they settled on Nora. "Miss Northcott," he gasped, looking as though he'd seen a ghost. "Hello, Thomas," Nora smiled warmly. "It's been a long time." "God Almighty," the man breathed. "We all thought," he broke off, glancing behind them as though expecting to see others. "Please come inside quickly." Once the door was closed, Harker turned to study Nora with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "Your uncle said you'd decided to remain back east, that you'd written to decline your inheritance." His gaze shifted to Kade, questioning. "This is Kade Daniels," Nora introduced. "He saved my life several times, in fact." As succinctly as possible, they explained the events of the past week, the stagecoach attack, their journey through the wilderness, and the men pursuing them on Clayton Northcott's orders. Harker's expression darkened as he listened. "I suspected foul play," he growled when they finished. "Your father's accident never sat right with me, 30 years in mining, and Edward Northcott suddenly makes a fatal mistake inspecting a shaft. Then Clayton produces a letter supposedly from you, renouncing your claim to the mine." He shook his head. "I voiced my concerns and found myself dismissed the following week. My uncle tried to have me killed, Thomas." Nora's voice was steady despite the gravity of her words. "And I believe he may have murdered my father as well." "Wouldn't put it past him," Harker agreed grimly. "Clayton always resented your father's success, and his decision to leave everything to you only made it worse. The mine has produced record profits this past year. With you out of the way, he stands to become one of the wealthiest men in Colorado Territory." "Tomorrow is my 21st birthday," Nora reminded him. "According to my father's will, I must present myself in person to claim my inheritance by then, or everything goes to my uncle permanently." "But you have no way to prove your identity," Harker guessed, eyeing their trail-worn appearance. "All your papers were lost in the stagecoach robbery." "Exactly," Nora's frustration was evident. "And I'm sure my uncle has spread word that I've declined my inheritance, making any claim I make now appear suspicious." Harker paced the small room, thinking. "There may be a way," he said finally. "Your father kept a private journal, recorded everything in it, including details about you that only he would know, personal things, memories from your childhood. He showed it to me once, said it was his way of keeping you close while you were away at school." Hope flickered in Nora's eyes. "Where is this journal now?" "In his study at the mansion, I expect. He kept it in a hidden compartment in his desk, said it was the one thing he never wanted Clayton to find." "Then we need to get into the mansion," Kade said, already considering the risks such an undertaking would entail. Harker nodded gravely. "Clayton will be at his club tonight. It's where he conducts most of his business these days. The mansion will be staffed only by servants, most of whom were loyal to your father." He turned to Nora. "If we can get you inside, find the journal, and then present you to Judge Wilson first thing in the morning, we might succeed." "Judge Wilson?" Kade questioned. "He's the executor of Edward's will," Harker explained. "A fair man, not easily bought. If we can convince him of Nora's identity and Clayton's treachery, he might rule in her favor despite the circumstances." A plan began to take shape. Harker would take them to the Northcott mansion under cover of darkness. While he created a diversion to occupy any watchful servants, Kade and Nora would slip into Edward Northcott's study to find the journal. If successful, they would spend the night at Harker's rooms, then present themselves to Judge Wilson first thing in the morning, Nora's birthday. "It's risky," Harker warned. "If Clayton's men have been watching the mansion, or if someone loyal to him raises the alarm." "We've faced worse odds this past week," Kade said with grim determination. He turned to Nora. "It's your decision. You're the one with everything to lose." Nora's violet eyes met his, resolute and unafraid. "My father built that mine from nothing. He wanted me to continue his legacy, to lead with the same fairness and vision he brought to it." She straightened her shoulders. "I won't let my uncle steal that from him or from me." "Then we go tonight," Harker decided. "But first, you both need food and clean clothes. You can't sneak into one of Denver's finest homes looking like you've been dragged through the wilderness." Within 2 hours, refreshed by hot food and attired in borrowed clothes that at least approximated respectability, they set out for the Northcott mansion. Harker had arranged for a closed carriage to transport them discreetly across town. away from prying eyes that might recognize Nora or report their presence to Clayton. The Northcott mansion stood on a hill overlooking Denver, its grand facade illuminated by gas lamps that lined the circular drive. Even in the darkness, its opulence was evident, 3 stories of imposing architecture that spoke of wealth and power. My father always thought it too ostentatious, Nora murmured as they observed the house from a discreet distance. He preferred simplicity, but my uncle insisted that the Northcott name demanded a certain appearance. Service entrance is around back, Harker directed the driver. Most of the staff will be in the kitchen or their quarters at this hour. As predicted, the service area was quiet, with just a soft glow from the kitchen windows indicating activity within. They left the carriage hidden among trees at the edge of the property and approached on foot, with Kade supporting Nora as her injured ankle still limited her mobility. "Mrs. Collins is the housekeeper," Harker whispered as they neared the door. "She served your family for 20 years. If she's on duty, she'll help us." They were in luck. The matronly woman who answered Harker's gentle knock nearly fainted at the sight of Nora, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle her exclamation of surprise. "Miss Northcott, is it truly you?" "Hello, Mrs. Collins," Nora smiled warmly. "I've come home." The housekeeper ushered them quickly into the kitchen, ensuring no other servants were present before embracing Nora with tears in her eyes. "We were told you weren't coming back," she said, studying Nora's face as though memorizing it anew. "Mr. Clayton said you'd written to decline your inheritance, that you preferred life in the East." "My uncle lied," Nora replied simply. "He sent men to ensure I never reached Denver." Mrs. Collins's expression hardened with immediate understanding. "That doesn't surprise me one bit. The master, your father, he never trusted his brother, especially near the end." She glanced toward the hallway. "What can I do to help?" "We need to reach my father's study without being seen," Nora explained. "There's something there that can prove my identity." "The journal," Mrs. Collins nodded knowingly. "He wrote in it every night, especially after receiving letters from you." She considered for a moment. "Most of the staff is gone for the evening, with just myself, the cook, and 2 footmen remaining. I can keep them occupied while you go upstairs." With the housekeeper's guidance, they navigated the servants' stairs to the main floor, then through shadowy corridors to Edward Northcott's study. The room was exactly as Nora remembered it, walls lined with books, a massive desk dominating the center, the scent of leather and pipe tobacco lingering even months after her father's death. "He always sat there," she said softly, moving toward the desk with reverent steps, "writing letters to me, managing the mine's accounts, planning for the future." Her fingers traced the polished wood surface. "I can almost feel his presence." Cade stood guard by the door while Nora and Harker searched for the hidden compartment in the desk. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they examined every inch of the ornate piece of furniture. "Here," Harker finally whispered, his fingers finding a nearly invisible seam along the desk's side panel. With gentle pressure, a small drawer slid open, revealing a leather-bound volume nestled within. Nora lifted the journal with trembling hands, opening it to find page after page filled with her father's bold handwriting. There were accounts of mine operations, personal reflections, and most preciously detailed records of Nora's childhood, her achievements at school, his hopes for her future. No one but Edward Northcott could have written these intimate observations. "This is it," she breathed, clutching the book to her chest. "This will prove who I am." Their elation was short-lived. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by male voices in the foyer, one of which Nora recognized immediately. "Clayton," she whispered, fear flashing in her eyes. "He's supposed to be at his club." "We need to leave, now." Cade moved to the study door, cracking it open to assess their escape route. The voices were growing closer, Clayton Northcott and at least 2 other men heading directly toward the study. "This way," Harker hissed, indicating a side door that led to an adjoining sitting room. They slipped through just as footsteps reached the study entrance. "I tell you, Wilson is becoming a problem." Clayton's voice drifted through the thin wall as they crept toward the sitting room's exit. "He's asking too many questions about Edward's accident and the girl's supposed letter of refusal." "Judges can be managed," another voice replied smoothly, "for the right price. Wilson isn't like the others. He and Edward were friends. He actually cares about honoring my brother's wishes." Clayton's tone was bitter. "If that brat had made it to Denver." "But she didn't," the second man reminded him. "And after tomorrow, the mine is yours permanently. The men I hired are professionals. If she somehow escaped the initial attempt, they'll find her before she reaches the city. Kade felt Nora tense beside him, her grip on the journal tightening. They needed to move, but any sound might alert the men in the study to their presence. With exquisite care, they eased toward the sitting room's far door, which Harker indicated would lead them to the main hallway and eventually back to the servants' stairs. Each step was agony for Nora on her injured ankle, but she moved with determined silence, the journal clutched protectively against her chest. They had almost reached the door when disaster struck. Nora's ankle, weakened by days of abuse, suddenly gave way. She stumbled, catching herself against a small table but sending a decorative vase crashing to the floor. The conversation in the study ceased abruptly. "What was that?" Clayton demanded. "There was no time for stealth now. Run." Kade urged, helping Nora toward the door as Harker moved to block the entrance from the study. They burst into the hallway just as Clayton and his companions entered the sitting room behind them. Shouts of alarm echoed through the house as they fled toward the servants' stairs, Nora hobbling as fast as her injury would allow. "Thieves, stop them!" Clayton's voice carried an edge of fury as footsteps pounded after them. They reached the back stairs just as one of the footmen appeared at the far end of the corridor. Kade pushed Nora ahead of him down the narrow staircase, turning to face their pursuer with his revolver drawn. "Stay back," he warned, backing down the stairs while keeping his weapon trained on the footman, who wisely chose to halt his pursuit. In the kitchen, Mrs. Collins was waiting anxiously. "This way," she urged, leading them toward a back door that opened onto the gardens. "The carriage is still by the trees." "Yes," Harker confirmed, supporting Nora as her strength began to flag. They fled across the moonlit grounds, aware of shouts and activity behind them as Clayton organized a search. The journal was secured inside Nora's bodice, pressed against her heart as they reached the waiting carriage. "Drive," Kade commanded as they tumbled inside. The driver needed no encouragement, snapping the reins to set the horses into immediate motion. As they pulled away from the Northcott estate, Kade peered through the small rear window to see lanterns bobbing across the grounds, their pursuers, but too late to catch them now. "That was too close," Harker said, his breathing ragged from exertion. "We got what we came for," Nora replied, patting her bodice where the journal rested. "And now we know for certain Clayton was behind the attempt on my life. And possibly my father's death as well." "What he said about Judge Wilson is encouraging," Harker noted. "If the judge is already suspicious of Clayton's story, he'll be more receptive to the truth." They returned to Harker's rooms above the livery, where they spent a tense night preparing for the morning's confrontation. Nora pored over her father's journal, rediscovering memories and finding specific details that would help establish her identity beyond doubt. "We should go to the judge's home first thing," Harker advised, "before Clayton has a chance to reach him or set watches at the courthouse." Kade remained vigilant throughout the night, revolver ready as he guarded the door and windows. He had no illusions about what would happen if Clayton's men found them before they could reach Judge Wilson. The mine owner had already demonstrated his willingness to commit murder to protect his claim. With his prize about to slip from his grasp, he would stop at nothing. As dawn broke on Nora's 21st birthday, they set out for Judge Horace Wilson's residence, a handsome home in one of Denver's better neighborhoods. Despite the early hour, a servant informed them that the judge was already awake and working in his study. When they were shown in, the judge, a dignified man in his 60s with a scholarly demeanor, looked up in surprise from his papers. "Thomas Harker," he greeted the foreman, "this is unexpected, and who might these young people be?" "Your Honor," Harker began formally, "may I present Miss Nora Northcott, daughter of Edward Northcott and Mr. Kade Daniels." Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose dramatically as he studied Nora. "Miss Northcott, but I was given to understand you had declined your inheritance and chosen to remain in the East." "That information was false, Your Honor," Nora replied steadily. "A fabrication by my uncle, who has gone to great lengths to prevent me from claiming what my father intended for me." Over the next hour, they presented their case: the stagecoach attack, the pursuit through the wilderness, and finally, the damning conversation they had overheard the previous night. Throughout, Judge Wilson listened attentively, his expression growing increasingly grave. "These are serious allegations," he said when they had finished. "Attempted murder, possible fraud, interference with illegal inheritance, if true, Mr. Clayton Northcott would face severe penalties under the law." "They are true, Your Honor," Nora assured him, producing the journal. "And this contains proof of my identity that only my father could have written. Details of my childhood, my education, our private correspondence over the years." Judge Wilson accepted the journal, examining it carefully before reading several passages. His expression softened as he recognized the handwriting and intimate knowledge contained within. "Edward always spoke of you with such pride," he said finally, closing the journal and returning it to Nora. "He was determined that you should inherit everything, despite those who thought a young woman incapable of managing such holdings." "Then you believe me?" Nora asked hopefully. "I do." The judge's expression grew determined. "And more than that, I've had my own suspicions about your uncle's sudden rise to power. Edward's accident never seemed plausible to me, nor did your supposed refusal of the inheritance." He rose from his desk. "The will is quite clear. Upon presenting yourself in person on or before your 21st birthday, all properties and holdings of Edward Northcott transfer to you immediately. As today is indeed your birthday, and I am satisfied as to your identity, I am prepared to execute the will as your father intended." Relief washed over Nora's face, her composure finally cracking as tears filled her eyes. Kade moved to her side, his hand finding hers in silent support. "There remains the matter of your uncle's criminal actions," Judge Wilson continued. "The allegations you've made warrant immediate investigation. With your permission, I'll send for the marshal and begin proceedings against Clayton Northcott at once." "Yes," Nora agreed, her voice firm despite her tears. "Justice must be served for my father's sake as well as my own." Events moved swiftly after that. Judge Wilson prepared the necessary documents to formalize Nora's inheritance, while also drafting arrest warrants for Clayton Northcott on charges of fraud and attempted murder. By mid-morning, the marshal and his deputies had been dispatched to the Northcott mansion, where they found Clayton preparing to flee the city. The news spread quickly through Denver. The missing heiress had returned, the corrupt uncle arrested, the Silver Peak mine returning to its rightful owner on the very day specified in Edward Northcott's will. It was the kind of dramatic tale the frontier press relished, and by afternoon, the story was being repeated in every saloon and parlor in the city. Amid the whirlwind of legal proceedings and public attention, Kade found himself increasingly uncertain of his place. Nora had reclaimed her position as one of Denver's wealthiest citizens, while he remained what he had always been, a drifter with little to his name beyond his horse and the clothes on his back. As evening approached, he stood on the balcony of the hotel suite Judge Wilson had arranged for Nora, looking out over the city lights and considering his next move. The Circle M ranch would still need hands, and he still needed work. The logical choice would be to say his goodbyes and continue on his way, as he had always done. Yet the thought of leaving Nora created a physical ache in his chest. In the short time they had known each other, she had become more important to him than he had believed possible. The feelings he had confessed in that ravine hadn't diminished with their arrival in civilization. If anything, they had grown stronger. But what could a cowboy with no prospects offer to a mining heiress? Her world of wealth and social standing was as foreign to him as the Eastern schools where she had been educated. Despite their connection, despite the love he felt for her, the practical reality remained. They came from different worlds. "There you are," Nora's voice interrupted his brooding thoughts. She stepped onto the balcony, resplendent in a new dress that highlighted her golden hair and violet eyes. "I've been looking for you." "Just needed some air," Kade replied, trying to mask the turmoil in his heart. Nora studied him, her perceptive gaze seeing through his attempted nonchalance. "You're thinking of leaving, aren't you?" There seemed little point in denying it. "You're safe now, your inheritance is secure. My part in this story is done." "Is that all it was to you? A story with a neat ending?" There was hurt in her voice, but also a challenge. "After everything we've been through together, everything we said to each other in that ravine." "I meant every word," Kade said earnestly, turning to face her fully. "But look around you, Nora. You're back in your world now, a world of wealth and privilege that I know nothing about. What place could I possibly have in it?" "Whatever place you want," she replied simply. "Or are you going to tell me that the man brave enough to face gunmen and survive wilderness pursuit is afraid of Denver society?" Despite himself, Kade smiled. "Society doesn't shoot at you, but it has other weapons." "Let me worry about society." Nora stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "What I can't bear is the thought of facing this new chapter alone. I need your strength, your honesty, your unwavering belief in doing what's right." Her voice softened. "I need you, Kade Daniels, not as a protector or guide, but as a partner." "In everything." The sincerity in her eyes undid him completely. All his carefully constructed arguments about their different worlds seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of the simple truth. They belonged together, had perhaps been destined to find each other from the moment he heard her crying by that stream. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now, without reservation or fear. "I think I've loved you since the moment you questioned whether a man could truly live without connection." "And I love you," Nora replied, her smile radiant as the setting sun caught in her golden hair. The cowboy who stopped to help a crying woman, never suspecting she would change his life as thoroughly as he changed hers. Their kiss was a promise of partnership, of shared dreams, of a future neither had imagined possible before their paths crossed on that lonely trail. Later, as they stood together in Judge Wilson's study for the formal reading of Edward Northcott's will, Nora's hand remained firmly clasped in Cade's. The judge noted their entwined fingers with an approving smile before reading the final clause of the document. "And to my beloved daughter, Nora, I leave not just material wealth but the wisdom to use it wisely. Find someone to share your life with who values character above fortune, courage above comfort, and love above all else. In this, as in all things, follow your heart without reservation." It seemed Edward Northcott had known his daughter well, and somehow anticipated exactly the kind of man she would need by her side. 6 months later, the Silver Peak mine was thriving under Nora's progressive management, with Thomas Harker reinstated as foreman and improved conditions for all workers. Clayton Northcott awaited trial in the territorial prison, his reputation and fortune equally ruined by his exposed crimes. And on a rise overlooking the city, construction had begun on a new home, not an ostentatious mansion like the one Nora had inherited, but a sturdy, beautiful ranch house with wide verandas and a magnificent view of the mountains. Beside it stood a large barn, completed first just as Cade had always planned, where fine horses grazed in lush pastures. "What do you think?" Nora asked as they stood on the porch of their nearly finished home, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their first child grew. Cade followed her gaze across the property, the land they had chosen together, the dream they were building with their combined vision. "I think your father would be proud," he said, drawing her into his arms, "of everything you've accomplished." "Of everything we've accomplished," she corrected, leaning against his chest. "A legacy built on partnership, just as he hoped." As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, Cade reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter with a crying woman to a love strong enough to overcome every obstacle, his life had transformed in ways he once would have thought impossible. The frontier had taught him that survival meant isolation, that attachment was weakness. Nora had taught him the greater truth, that real strength came from connection, that a life shared was a life truly lived. And in her love, the cowboy who had drifted for so long had finally found his home.